I went to check out the National Die-In Day in Los Angeles. I made sure to arrive early since I figured it might be quite a big event, given the last March for Our Lives protests held around the country.
Just over 200,000 supporters. They were joined by protesters in more than 800 cities in what was billed as the March for Our Lives.
I had, however, forgotten that it's summer vacation, which seemed to have had a drastic effect on the turnout. Funny how when school's in, it's quite easy to get kids to take the day off to protest. Yet when it's vacation and they don't have a class to miss, they'd rather be, well, I don't know, having some fun. The point is, I could have turned up a little later. This rally was fairly low-key, and it wasn't a real die-in, as everyone just pretended to be dead. It was highlighted as a vigil to the victims of the Pulse nightclub massacre, and as I watched speaker after speaker talk about gun violence, they never once apportioned blame to the perpetrator, Omar Mateen, or his ideology and connections to extremists. Rather, they lamented that lax controls on guns, the lack of gun-free zones, and the NRA were the real culprits. Like any protest these days, it's not really a protest without some kind of celebrity guest appearance. Today's was Alyssa Milano, who had some choice words to say about the current administration.
Yeah. And let me tell you, we have a whole lot more love and hope on our side than they have assholes.
Then came her Declaration of Independence, along with her list of demands.
Thus reaffirming the Declaration of Independence, promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we demand that our government places the prevention of gun violence high on the public agenda. We demand that the federal government funds rigorous, apolitical, scientific studies of the effects of gun violence in our nation. We demand action by federal, state, and local authorities to reduce and prevent gun violence in their communities and by law enforcement agencies. We demand the reform and retraining of law enforcement and armed public officials. We demand that those who suffer the most from gun violence receive the most immediate remedies for gun violence. We demand.
Oof, she seems quite high maintenance. I'll also remind you that whenever Alyssa Milano attends these public events, she always brings her armed security guard, armed with a concealed pistol. Yeah, I saw you checking me out, Alyssa. Sorry, you're just not my type. Other speakers joined Alyssa in expressing their frustration at gun violence in America, but the conversation rarely turned towards why the violence is taking place. Given that the epidemic of mass shootings in schools and other public places seemed to have started only 20 or so years ago, I would think that the gist of the conversation should be about why human behavior seems to have radically changed, particularly when it comes to kids shooting their fellow classmates. One speaker introduced herself as an undocumented illegal immigrant. I wasn't quite fast enough to whip my camera out to catch the top of her speech, but here are some of her ideas.
The U.S. was founded on the genocide of Native Americans. The European man and his allies murdered natives with guns. Guns literally built this country, which is why there is no surprise that the Constitution grants everyone the right to bear arms. Guns are a burden in this country for people of color and minorities because we are directly affected by guns in our neighborhoods and because we don't receive any of the money that the NRA does. Our entire existence has been criminalized and guns are flooding in our communities. Police fatally shoot black and brown folk because they can get away with it. In this country, you have to have more training hours in cosmetology than to become a police officer, literally.
Lord, you tell me! Lord, I said, Lord, say something! Go! Are you back? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It's really soft, it has body to it. The day after recruits got their turn experiencing the debilitating pain of a taser,
We're gonna grab this.
direct exposure to a type of pepper spray,
Equating police training programs to that of cosmetology, an argument popularized by Colin Kaepernick, is an apples and oranges comparison that fails to take into consideration the comparative intensity, ongoing training outside of academy attendance, and public versus private funding of said courses.
We must have longer training periods for police that includes racial bias training, because police continue to prove that they mishandle guns and situations involving guns.
Police also prove day in and day out exactly how to handle guns, having defended the lives of countless people in this country, but those stories aren't politically convenient. The protest organisers then led the eclectic group of die-inners with only a handful of students and, of course, Alyssa Milano, in the die-in. This whole concept seems to me to be yet another leftist example of playing the victim. In this case, quite literally. I was left thinking that the die-in crowd could have learned something from the Korean protesters who were just a block away protesting the mayor's decision to put a homeless shelter in their neighborhood. They just seem to have a lot more gusto. Overall, the die-in wasn't to die for, although there were a few heartfelt gestures made for the victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting, which was indeed a tragic event. The blame for this tragedy was placed on the NRA and the Second Amendment, as opposed to the perpetrator. This often happens after a shooting tragedy, and it always leads to an emotional rather than rational discussion. Having an illegal immigrant child assert that guns are a symbol of and are synonymous with colonialism, imperialism, and racism, all the while standing on the steps of a building protected by police, in a protest protected by police, all who have guns, is a pretty bad PR move, particularly considering Alyssa Milano's bodyguard is packing heat. I'm not sure where she's from, but I can guarantee with absolute certainty that the people in power in her former country have plenty of guns, regardless of their race. Given how she feels about guns, I'm wondering if her solution is like that of Esquire's Dave Holmes, who recently asserted in an article he wrote after the Texas school shooting that he wanted to take everyone's guns and have them melted down only to turn them into a giant sphere that would chase them down like the boulder in Indiana Jones. Imaginative, right? Now, I'm not against the right to protest, but I have to call out stupidity when I see it, and laying around playing dead isn't going to solve gun violence. Blaming a tool, which over 200,000 women a year use to defend themselves against violence and sexual assault, isn't a good look either. Calling a gun rights advocacy group evil because they represent the interests of their members, who pay for them to do so, and equating this with murder is irresponsible and downright wrong. Representing the interests of your organization's members, which happen to also be in direct cohesion with the Constitution, namely the Second Amendment, isn't the same thing as killing people. If it was, then I would be able to blame March for Our Lives or any other gun control advocacy group every time an unarmed civilian is killed in a gun-free zone, because they weren't able to defend themselves with a firearm. The true causes and the solutions to gun violence in America lie in the hearts and minds of its people, and not in their holsters.